think my comments will be brief so that we can leave enough time for the discussion. Instead of discussing each paper separately, I think I'll talk about three of them together and try to outline some areas of similarities and differences among our authors here. So all three papers seem to concur that the role of China is undeniable in the effectiveness of any global strategies to deal with climate change. So as we've heard again and again, in just a few decades of reform and modernization, China has turned itself into the largest emitter of greenhouse gases, the largest consumer of energy resources, the largest producer of manufacturers, and the second largest economy in the world. So China is thus a main contributor to the current environmental challenges that we face. Also equally important and somewhat hidden in the papers is that China is also a main recipient of the problems brought by climate change, since consider Chinese people are not just nationals of a nation state, but 1/5 of humanity. So problems such as higher temperatures, rising sea level, and freshwater shortages might find the most numerous victims and most vulnerable victims in the most populated nation around the world. So I felt that also is important now to just emphasize on the side of it being a contributor to problems, but also the people themselves living in China might be one of the worst victims. So all the papers adopted a state-centered approach. I know that Jim has somewhat given us a critique of possible problems with that approach, but I think all the papers we've heard in this panel tend to adopt the state-centered approach and focusing on how the Chinese government has responded to international initiatives and pressures, as well as domestic challenges to human security. They point out that there is some change in the government's awareness and position in recent years, though they differ on the significance and meaning of that change. Tim seems to think that the Chinese response is rather limited. And he comments in his paper that China's declared commitments are probably just a reframing of concerns rather than a fundamental transformation. He seems to agree that Chinese participation might even be a relatively opportunistic one, because the government's main concern remains to be economic growth and its own political legitimacy. Partly sharing the last assumption, Dr. Lewis notices a consistent but gradual change in state attitudes towards global cooperation. And she, in the end, she comments it's probably unrealistic to demand China abandon the goal of growth. And she seems to be quite concerned with something she calls in her paper the fire war between developing and developed countries, which she finds the Chinese government has manipulated from time to time to suit its needs. She points out that the inaction of the U.S. also gave China an excuse of not trying to be fully committed to international environmental goals. And Dr. Jen and Ms. GP's paper probably have the most positive assessment of the situation that we were studying. They point to the China flag theory that might have permeated political and economic debates about China and possibly informed some of the assumptions behind the studies of environmentalism. And they argue that China increasingly recognizes its responsibilities gradually. And like she said just a few moments ago, that more practical attitudes are needed in studying China's dilemmas and competing goals. But both authors are no less insistent that China must do more and must set a good example. So I think that these are the areas of similarities and differences that I would like to point out, and maybe to get our presenters to speak to each other about the different interpretations as well, or maybe explain why they have such different takes on this very big issue, I acknowledge, to the environment. And I also wish to ask perhaps our presenters to consider the point they make about how economic growth and political legitimacy are intimately connected, and perhaps how the local is figured in these issues that they're studying. One thing perhaps that I like to point out is economic growth is also a cause of social unrest in China. It's not just the basic political legitimacy, the well-known problem of migrant laborers living in Chinese cities. Over the summer, there were lots of news coming from China about worker suicides, Foxconn, work conditions in factories, etc., etc. Economic growth also has not stopped some from demanding political change, including our guest of honor, Ms. Daiqin. We one example of people who still, despite the economic growth, GDP figures, still find that the political system or CCP's legitimacy is very, controversial or debatable. And from my own reading of some of the environmental issues in China, there often seem to be small-scale, sporadic, local protests and blockades that happen quite frequently in China. In some of China's smaller towns and cities, they protest against garbage dumps, polluted water, toxic industries. Some of them were successful to a certain degree, but they are all not, this kind of uncoordinated and short-lived, right? And they also tend to happen below the radar of Western media and go unreported. So the idea that only the center or the central state as the area of action or the area that only mattered in the joint efforts to bring changes might be overlooking some of the issues that happen on the local level. Although I do not want to romanticize, what the kind of role that local actors could take on, but sometimes they are also quite problematic, or they are not without politics itself. But I wonder if anyone has given any attention to local actors, local activities in your areas of work. And one author that comes to mind is an anthropologist called Robert Mueller, who has done work on these local notions of the environment that are often quite unfamiliar to us who speak in terms of ozone layers, acid rain, protected endangered species. Just local variations of how they understood the environment often happen in figure in terms of fertility, feng shui. So what maybe some consideration of what Chinese local people, despite government control or indifference or even suppression, might be doing in their localities. A second point about economic growth is that, of course, the desire for uninterrupted economic growth and its relationship to political legitimacy is far from being specific and unique to China. So as we have seen on Tuesday night in the U.S., general sense of a lack of economic recovery and job creation dominated voters' concerns of the election and passive blow at the Obama administration and his take on energy policy. So I think that perhaps that the emphasis on how economic growth is crucial to political legitimacy also needs to be taken within the context of a more interdependent and globalized world. I also wonder if there's, in your work, or whether you have any interest in pursuing comparative studies of China with the US or China with other developing countries, since there is a problem of seeing whether China trying to manipulate that divide between the developed and the developing world and find itself sometimes advantageous to sit in one camp and to be in other cases. I wonder if there are, academically, we can do anything to kind of question that divide by pursuing comparative studies in these areas and try to see maybe U.S. and China compare quite well on certain areas. So I think I'll stop here.
Thank you, Brian.